Hi everyone, and welcome back to another video. In this one we're going to be looking at World of Tanks, and more specifically some top tips, around about 10, for any new player to help them get settled into the game and get playing effectively as soon as possible. You're going to be seeing footage from several different games. Really, I've just used the most appropriate footage for the given point that I'm trying to make. Most importantly, if you are new to the game, I highly recommend you do the boot camp missions. Not only do you learn the basics much quicker that way, you also get a bunch of gold, a bunch of silver, not to mention some crews on 100%, so you can already start training them on some specialist skills. World of Tanks can be quite overwhelming when you're a new player, but if you follow these simple tips, then they'll help you get well on the way towards being much more effective and having a whole heap of fun, as well as winning some games and starting to work your way up the tech tree towards some of those iconic tanks that people love. So, let's get on with the video. First tip is about the minimap. Make it bigger. Hit the plus key 2 or 3 times, make it large enough so that it doesn't obstruct your view, but that you can see it out of your peripheral vision without actually having to stare and focus at it. This will help you have a much better situational awareness of what's going on with the battle, as well as what's going on with your own team and where they are. Tip number 2 is to remember that, especially at lower tiers, your tank has very poor armour. You're not going to be bouncing many shots in the first couple of tiers. There are exceptions, but it's just easier to apply it as a general rule. Hide behind cover, make use of destroyed tanks, do anything to avoid getting hit if possible. And that leads nicely into tip 3, which is don't rush in expecting to win the round in the first minute. You're far better off being more circumspect and taking your time, assess where the best place to be is, and really the longer you're in the game and doing damage, the more chance you have of actually influencing the round in favour of your team and getting the win. Tip number 4 is to know the role of your tank. That's something you'll get better at over time, but at least if you have the knowledge to start with, then you're building on it rather than starting from a position of not knowing at all. Obviously we've got light tanks, which pretty much most of the tier 1 tanks are anyway. Light tanks' traditional role is for scouting. That's more important in some maps than others. It's also a very challenging role to play in World of Tanks right now, so it's not something I'd recommend to a new player once you've got out of the first couple of tiers. Then we have medium tanks, which are kind of a jack of all trades. Some are better than others, normally have quite a reasonable gun, fairly reasonable speed, reasonable armour, don't excel in everything, but tend not to be poor in any one thing. A group of, or a platoon of medium tanks can be absolutely devastating if they're working together to take down a tougher enemy. Then we've got heavy tanks. The role of a heavy tank really is to push and use their better armour and a better hit points pool to try and force their way forward, or to stop the enemy heavy tanks from doing the same thing. Tank destroyers are ambush vehicles. Their ideal opportunity is to have a long line of sight and to be able to hide behind cover or bushes so that they can snipe without being seen and again return fire. They tend to have the best penetration guns in the game. That's not a definitive rule, but as a generality it's normally the case. It can be very frustrating when you're in the sights of a tank destroyer and you can't see them whilst they're happily plinking away at you. Then we have the class that everyone loves to hate, artillery. Limited to 3 artillery vehicles per game. That's far better than in the bad old days when sometimes you'd have 5 or more. Your job is to support the other tanks. Offensively, you're trying to take out tanks which are blocking your tanks from advancing. Defensively, you're going to want to help your tanks that are trying to prevent the enemy from advancing by dropping artillery on the attacking vehicles. Tip number 5 is to know the objective of the round that you're playing in. That might be to capture the enemy's base or kill all their tanks, or it might be a meeting engagement where both teams are trying to reach the same objective. There's other game modes, but they're the ones most likely that you'll be playing in to start with. Tip number 6 is hold down and side scraping, which I'm going to demonstrate in the next 2 little clips. Hold down is where you have the lower part of your tank protected by environmental objects or wrecked tanks. It just keeps the vulnerable parts of the tank harder to hit. Side scraping is when you drive up towards a corner of a building and then gradually back away from it at a slight angle so that you move out away from the building and until you can just shoot past it and keep anything that's coming from that direction pinned down. When they shoot back at you, the idea being that if you could get the angle right, pretty much anything that hits your side will be an automatic bounce, or mainly they'll only have the tracks to hit, which will just lose you a track and nothing else. Tip number 7 is to learn to use weak spots on your enemy's vehicles. You might have a great deal of difficulty penetrating the majority of the frontal armour on a tank, but if you can get a shot into the lower front plate, or maybe to a machine gun port or the cupola, then you're going to find that actually you might have a chance of taking it down. Sides tend to be weaker than the front, and the rear tends to be the weakest of all. Tip number 8 is to learn to use concealment. You have 2 values for concealment on each vehicle, one being moving, one being stationary. Light tanks only ever use the stationary value, so that's why they can zoom around the map and stay fairly well hidden. Also, things like bushes between you and the target make a big difference. If you drive up to a bush in sniper mode until it goes see-through, and then back away until it goes obscures your view again, that will give you the maximum cover you can get from that particular bush. Tip number 9. Don't use automatic aim unless you're in a faster, smaller vehicle circling a larger, slower vehicle. It doesn't aim for weak spots and you're more likely to bounce. Tip number 10. Always be thinking, what do I need to do to win this game? Will capping be more effective, or is it better to try and hunt down the remainder of the enemy team? Am I better hanging back to deal damage, or am I better pushing forwards? This is something you learn with experience, but it's a great habit to get into when you first start playing. I hope you found the tips useful, and if you enjoyed the video, please give me a thumbs up and subscribe, as it really helps me grow the channel. Thanks a lot, and see you next time.